Smile and learn!
Hello, everyone! Today we're going to learn how we classify living things. First, let's start with a question. Do you remember what all living things have in common? And the answer is that they all fulfill the vital functions. And do you remember what are the vital functions? Here's a hint. There are 3. Good job! The vital functions of living things are interaction, nutrition, and reproduction. Well, let's get down to business. There are many ways to classify living things, but the most common way is to group them by kingdoms. There are 5 kingdoms in total: animal, plant, fungi, Monera, and Protista, also called Protista. We divide them in this way because the living things in each kingdom have common characteristics, and they're significantly different from the living things in other kingdoms. Let's take a closer look. The animal kingdom. The first kingdom we'll talk about is the animal. There are many, many, many animal species. I'm sure you know a lot of them. But did you know that human beings are also animals? Let's take a look at some characteristics of the animal kingdom. Animals are multicellular. That means that they're made up of more than one cell. Interesting. All animals are heterotrophic, which means that they eat other organisms to get the substances they need to survive. Another important characteristic of the animal kingdom is that almost all of them can move on their own. So, the characteristics of the animal kingdom are the following. They're multicellular, heterotrophic, and most of them can move on their own. The plant kingdom. The plant kingdom is characterized by the fact that all plants, whether they're trees, bushes, or flowers, are autotrophic. That means that they make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. They're also multicellular. Like we said before, it means that they're made up of more than one cell. But unlike animals, plants cannot move on their own. So the characteristics of the plant kingdom are as follows. They're multicellular, autotrophic, and do not move on their own. The fungi kingdom. The fungi kingdom is characterized by unicellular organisms, such as yeasts, or multicellular organisms like mushrooms and mold. This means that they can be made up of one cell or many cells. All fungi are heterotrophic. Do you remember what that means? That's right! Heterotrophic means that they cannot make their own food, so they eat other organisms. The thing that fungi like to eat the most are decomposing mushrooms. Ew! And would you say that they can move on their own? Of course not. Have you ever seen a mushroom walking? To sum up, the characteristics of the fungi kingdom are the following. They can be both unicellular and multicellular. They are heterotrophic, and they do not move on their own. The Monera Kingdom. The Monera Kingdom is characterized by the simplest and most primitive forms of life. The Monera Kingdom is made up of unicellular organisms. These organisms are so small that you can only see them with a microscope. Bacteria can either make their own food or take it from the environment where they live. This means that they can be autotrophic and heterotrophic. Now that's a cool fact! Did you know that there are some beneficial bacteria for humans? Like those that make yogurt, and others that are harmful that can cause diseases such as salmonella. Let's sum up the characteristics of the Monera Kingdom as the following. They're unicellular organisms. They can be made autotrophic and heterotrophic. And there are some beneficial bacteria and some that can be harmful to humans. The Protista or Protista Kingdom. And finally, we'll talk about the Protista Kingdom, also called the Protista Kingdom, which includes protozoa and algae. The organisms in this kingdom can be unicellular, like protozoa, and some types of algae, or multicellular, like many other types of algae. Both types are only visible through a microscope. In this kingdom, we can find heterotrophic beings, like amoeba, that eat other organisms, and also autotrophs, such as algae, that make their own food using photosynthesis. Let's take out our notepad for the last time. The characteristics of the Protista Kingdom, or Protista, are as follows. They can be unicellular and multicellular organisms. And they can also be autotrophic and heterotrophic. Wow, we learned so many things about the kingdoms of living things. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Until next time!
Hello, friends! Do you know what living beings are and what they have in common? You don't? Well, you can't miss this video to learn what types of living beings exist and what their vital functions are. Living beings can be unicellular organisms, meaning they consist of one single cell. Microorganisms, like bacteria, are unicellular organisms. Living beings can also be multicellular organisms, like trees or birds, that consist of many cells. This means that we consider plants, animals, and microorganisms as living beings. Do you know what these living beings have in common? The vital functions. Despite the differences among them, living beings share a common characteristic. They all carry out the vital functions. The vital functions of living beings are interaction, nutrition, and reproduction. Do they sound familiar? Let's have a closer look at them. The vital function of interaction enables living beings to interact with their surroundings via information or signals they receive. This way, they can respond, act, or react depending on the situation. Fleeing from danger like fire is an example of how animals interact with their surroundings. Human beings interact with one another as well. For example, when someone smiles at us, we usually smile back. Or plants, for example, that grow toward the sun and branch their roots toward water. The vital function of nutrition provides living beings with energy and necessary nutrients for survival. To carry out this function, living beings need water, air, and nutrients. The majority of living beings get nutrients from the food they eat. For example, having breakfast gives you the nutrients you need. The function of reproduction enables living beings to ensure survival of the species by giving birth to new living beings. In the animal kingdom, we classify living beings in viviparous animals born from their mother's womb and oviparous animals that hatch from eggs. Another example would be certain plants whose fruits or seeds fall on the ground and put out shoots for new plants of the same species to grow. Living beings share many interesting things, don't they? Different living beings like microorganisms, plants, or animals share the vital functions. This way, they all interact, stay nourished, and reproduce. Don't miss other videos to keep on learning with us.
Hey! How much do you know about the relationships between living beings? Join me to discover the most important ones. Living beings establish relationships with each other in order to survive and maintain the balance of ecosystems. Resources like water, food, or territory are limited, so different living beings compete for them through different types of relationships. There are two types of relationships: intraspecific and interspecific. In intraspecific relationships, the living things are of the same species. In contrast, in interspecific relationships, the living beings involved are of different species. Today we will learn the types of interspecific relationships. We will discover the four most common types of interspecific relationships: predation, parasitism, mutualism, and symbiosis. Predation. This type of interspecific relationship occurs when one living being eats another. That's to say, one has a meal, but the other dies. Oh no! One example is bears and salmon, because salmon serve as food for the great grizzly bear. Can you think of any other examples? Parasitism. In this case, an organism known as a parasite lives in or on another organism, called a host. In this type of relationship, the host doesn't die, but it does suffer from some type of damage from the parasite. In other words, one living being benefits and the other is harmed. An example of parasitism would be a tick biting a human. Mutualism. In the case of mutualism, both species benefit from the relationship. For example, a bird eating the parasites that infect the body of an ox is beneficial for the bird because it allows it to obtain nutrients. It's also good for the ox, as it avoids any harm that the parasites might cause. Symbiosis. Symbiosis is a relationship between two organisms where both benefit, but neither could survive without the other. Take lichens, for example. Lichens may look like spots or tiny plants, but the truth is that they're the product of a symbiotic relationship between fungus and algae. The algae brings nutrients to the relationship, and the fungus provides a way to stick to the surface, as well as protection. A perfect combination. That's all for today, friends. See you soon.
Hello, friends! Today, we're going to explore the differences between heterotrophs and autotrophs. Living beings need to carry out 3 vital functions to survive. Do you remember which ones? That's right! Nutrition, interaction, and reproduction. Today, we're going to find out more about the function of nutrition. Thanks to the function of nutrition, living beings get the energy they need to carry out everyday activities like moving, walking, or even thinking. But where do we get all this energy from? From food! In other words, from what we eat. Based on their mode of nutrition, living beings are classified into 2 major groups: autotrophs and heterotrophs. The word autotroph has a distinct definition. Auto means self, and troph means nourishing. This explains the fact that autotrophic organisms make their own food to get the energy they need for everyday activities. In other words, autotrophic organisms produce their own food. Plants are an example of autotrophic organisms because they make their own food and obtain energy during the process of photosynthesis. The word heterotroph also has a distinct definition. Hetero means other, and troph means nourishing. This means that heterotrophic organisms cannot make their own food. They must eat to obtain energy and survive. Animals, including humans, are an example of heterotrophic organisms. They consume food from an outside source to obtain energy for their day-to-day activities. As we have seen, there are autotrophic organisms that produce their own food, and heterotrophic organisms that obtain nutrients from other organisms. You've learned how to differentiate them. See you soon!
Hello, hello! How are you today? I have a question for you. Do you like food? I love food. It gives us the energy we need to play, study, think, and be healthy. I'm sure you know that without food, no living thing can survive. Living things get energy from the food we eat. Some can produce their own food, while others get energy by eating plants or other animals. The way energy passes from one living thing to another is called a food chain. Have you ever heard of food chains? We are going to look at them now, but I'm getting a little hungry. So first, I'm going to take a bite of my lamb chops. Yummy! So, what is a food chain anyways? It's a diagram that shows how living things are connected by what they eat. In other words, it tells us how plants and animals depend on each other for food. In fact, I'm part of a food chain right now. Let's see what the food chain looks like when I eat my lamb chops. At the first level, we have grass, a plant that produces its own food through photosynthesis. Then, on the second level, we have a lamb, which eats the grass. Finally, I'm on the last level because I eat the meat from the lamb. There are many food chains. Let's look at another more complex example. Picture a beautiful flower. When the flower needs energy, it makes it from the sun, water, and nutrients from the soil. through photosynthesis. But along comes a very hungry caterpillar, and it eats the flower. And then along comes a very, very hungry bird, so it eats the caterpillar. But later, a super hungry coyote comes along and eats the bird. Wow! Now, this story gets a little sad, but it's something that happens to all living things. After a long and happy life, our coyote dies. But don't worry, this is when things get interesting. Now it's time for the bacteria and fungi to do their job. We can't see them, but they're everywhere. They will eat the coyote's body. When they do so, they turn the coyote into nutrients that the plants can use to make their own food. Amazing, right? And so the food chain starts again. As you can see, food chains have different levels, which we call trophic levels. Let's learn about them. Food chains can start with an autotrophic plant or producer that makes its own food. In the example from before, the flower is our producer. But, as we know, not all living things can produce their own food. These living beings are called heterotrophs, and they eat other living things to get energy. Animals that eat producers are called primary consumers. In this food chain, the caterpillar is our primary consumer. Next, there are animals that eat the primary consumers. These are called secondary consumers, like the bird in this food chain. Then, animals that eat the secondary consumers are called tertiary consumers, like the coyote in our example. Finally, the fungi and bacteria that decompose the tertiary consumers when they die are the decomposers. Decomposers are very important because they restart the food chain. Thanks to them, it begins all over again. Remember that all living things need energy to live. A food chain helps us to see where living things get their energy. There are different levels within food chains. Let's see if you can put them in order. Got it? Let's see if you have it right. First, we have the producers. Producers are eaten by primary consumers. Primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers. And secondary consumers are eaten by tertiary consumers. And who makes sure that the cycle starts all over again? Exactly! The decomposers. They do so by eating the tertiary consumers. Wow! Food chains are so interesting, right? We've looked at a couple of examples today. But remember that there are so many food chains on our planet. We'll discover them in the next episode. Don't miss it. See you then! Hello, hello. How are you today? Are you hungry? I am, a little, but I have a snack here. Yummy! I'm sure you remember that food gives us the energy we need to play, study, think, and be healthy. You probably also remember that without food, no living thing can survive. Living things get energy from the food we eat. The way energy passes from one living thing to another is called a food chain. Remember? One way to classify food chains is by the habitats where the living beings in the chain get their food. Let's think about our planet and all the habitats on Earth. How many habitats can you think of? That's it. There are two general types of natural habitats, terrestrial and aquatic. The living things in these habitats form many food chains. So we can classify food chains in two ways, terrestrial food chains and aquatic food chains. Terrestrial food chains. Terrestrial food chains exist both on land and below the surface of the Earth. For example, we find terrestrial food chains in the desert, forest, and savanna. Can you think of any other terrestrial habitats? Come with me. We're going to look at an example. Plants get the energy they need from the sun, water, carbon dioxide, and nutrients from the soil. A primary consumer, like a caterpillar, eats the plant's leaves. Yum, how tasty! Then the caterpillar goes underground. But suddenly, a centipede eats it. Later, a mole comes along and eats the centipede. Delicious! A while later, a hungry snake eats the mole. And just a few hours after that, a hawk swoops down and eats the snake. When the hawk dies, decomposers break down its body and turn it into nutrients that plants use to make their own food. And so this terrestrial food chain begins all over again. Amazing, right? All these living things obtain their food in terrestrial habitats. So we can say that this is a terrestrial food chain. Aquatic food chains. Aquatic food chains occur both in and near water. They happen in rivers, lakes, seas, and oceans, but also along the coast. The living things that make up aquatic food chains get their food from aquatic habitats. They can live in water, like fish, but they can also live on land and eat aquatic living things like bears. That is why we say that aquatic food chains happen both near and in water. Come with me under the sea to see an example. In the ocean, we can find many producers, such as these algae. As we know, algae are plants who get energy through photosynthesis. But, sea snails like them too! Now a hungry eel comes swimming along, sees the snail, and eats it. But then a salmon enters the picture and eats the eel. This is where the story gets interesting. Adult salmon live in saltwater, but they lay their eggs in freshwater. So our salmon leaves the ocean and swims upstream to lay her eggs in a river. Suddenly, boom! A hungry bear wants his dinner. So he walks down to the river looking for fish. Today is his lucky day, and he finds a delicious salmon to eat. Yum! As you can see, even though the bear lives on land, this is an aquatic food chain, because all the living things in it get their food from aquatic habitats. Remember, we can classify food chains by the habitats where the living beings in the chain get their food. If all of the living beings get their food from aquatic habitats, even if one of them lives on land, we classify the chain as aquatic. Let's see if you can tell me. Are these terrestrial or aquatic food chains? Terrestrial or aquatic? Terrestrial, because the living beings in this food chain get their food from terrestrial habitats. Let's try another one. Aquatic, because the living beings in this food chain get their food from aquatic habitats. Very good. Now for the last one. Terrestrial or aquatic? Aquatic, because although the bear lives in a terrestrial habitat, it and the rest of the living beings in this food chain get their food from aquatic habitats. Great! You did an awesome job! Wow! Food chains are so interesting! In this video, we have seen one way to classify them, but we still have more to learn. See you in the next episode! Bye-bye! Hi, everyone! How is it going? Imagine this situation. You are very hungry after a long day at school. You get home and see that Dad is in the kitchen preparing something. So you ask, "Hey, Dad, what's for dinner?" What would you think if he said, "dead stuff"? Oh my gosh! Believe it or not, the food we eat is not far removed from dead stuff, or even poop. That's what we're going to talk about today. But first, do you remember what a food chain is? A food chain is a process that shows how living things are connected by what they eat. We have already learned to classify aquatic and terrestrial food chains like these. But did you know that there's another way to classify food chains? Let's find out more about it. Green food chains. We have already seen many green food chains, also called predator food chains or grazing food chains. The first level of these food chains is a producer, which, important, is alive and makes its own food through photosynthesis. That's where the name green food chain comes from, because these producers are alive and green, like grass or any other living plant. Brown food chains. On the other hand, brown food chains, also called detritus food chains, don't start with living plants. They start with, you guessed it, dead stuff. Yikes! How is this possible? Well, you know that all living things die. Like plants, for example. Many plants are never eaten while they're alive. They live a long and happy life and then die, leaving their remains. Have you ever gone for a walk in the park in autumn? If you look at the ground, you'll see a lot of dead plant remains, like leaves, branches, and even roots. We call these remains detritus, or dead stuff, and they form the first level of brown food chains. Here we can see this hungry worm eating some delicious dead stuff. Then a chicken eats the poor worm. And later, a human eats the chicken. Wow! See? We're not too far removed from dead things in brown food chains. Brown food chains are extremely important for sustaining the Earth's ecosystems. In fact, 90% of the food chains on Earth are brown. Amazing, right? Did you know that when a whale dies and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, it creates food chains that can exist for months or even years? It's all because of the dead whale's detritus. This is what happens. The whale lives a long and happy life and then dies. The whale's body is converted into detritus with the help of the bacteria and fungi in the water. Then, other living creatures like crabs eat that detritus. Then, a fish eats one of those crabs. An octopus eats the fish. And a shark eats the octopus. Later, the shark dies, sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and with the help of those super cool bacteria and fungi becomes, you guessed it, detritus, a scrumptious meal for a hungry crab. And so the brown food chain starts all over again. Pretty incredible, isn't it? Remember that green food chains start with living plants and brown food chains start with dead stuff, such as plant remains, animal remains, or even poop. Green or brown? Brown, because it starts with plant remains. Dead stuff. On to the next one. Green or brown? Green, because it starts with grass, which is a producer that is alive. On to the last one. Green or brown? Brown, because it starts with detritus or remains of the whale. See what I'm saying? Most food chains are brown. Great work! You've done a super job! So, even if you don't really feel like eating dead stuff for dinner, the animals we eat, or the ones they eat, sure do. Aren't food chains interesting? Now we know that there are many ways to classify them. Bon appetit! See you next time!
Hey, friends! Today we're going to take a super interesting journey inside living beings. First, we'll start with the cell, which is the smallest basic unit that can live on its own. And bit by bit, we'll go through tissues, organs, systems, apparatus, and finally, the organism. The human body is an example of how living beings are organized. Have you ever wondered how our body is organized on the inside? Well, let's get started. The vital functions of a living being are nutrition, interaction, and reproduction. The cell is the smallest basic unit that fulfills the vital functions. We're all made up of millions of cells. Tissues are made up of the same types of cells that carry out the same function. There are 4 tissue types in our body: connective tissue, epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. The nerve tissue cells are called neurons. Can you guess what muscle tissue cells are called? Very good! They are called muscle cells. Organs are made up of tissues that work together to carry out the same function. These functions can range from locomotion, which means movement, all the way up to a heartbeat. One example is a muscle, which is made up of muscle tissue. Systems are made up of organs that work in a coordinated manner to perform a function. Do you think our lungs would do us any good if we didn't have the larynx or trachea? Of course not. Each organ has a function, and together they make our body work. For example, the muscular system is made up of muscles. The apparatuses are made up of different organs and systems that carry out a function together. For example, the musculoskeletal system consists of the skeletal system and the muscular system. Isn't it amazing what our body is capable of? And finally, we'll talk about the organism, which is made up by the combination of all apparatuses and systems. We are an organism, i.e., we are made up of apparatuses and systems. What a trip we've had! Together we've learned what types of components make up our organism. We started with the cell, then moved through the tissues, organs, systems, apparatuses, and we finished with the organism. I hope you had as much fun as I did on this trip. See you soon!
The cell. A cell is the smallest unit of life of living organisms. Cells are so small that we cannot see them with our naked eyes. Cells have different structures and functions, but all of them are made up by an outer coating and a water-based interior where organelles are found. They are alive, and some of their functions include nutrition, transformation of substances into energy, structural changes. They can suffer alterations in their structure and purpose, growth and mitosis. They are able to control their own process of growth and division. There are unicellular and multicellular organisms depending on the number of cells they are made up of. Unicellular organisms are very small, and they consist of one cell only. Bacteria are unicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms are made up by a large number of cells. Trees, animals, or human beings are multicellular organisms. Based on their structure, cells are grouped in prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. The main characteristic of prokaryotic cells is that DNA, the genetic material, is floating in the cytoplasm instead of being stored in the nucleus. Bacteria are prokaryotic cells. The main characteristic of eukaryotic cells is that their nucleus is protected by a membrane. DNA is found inside eukaryotic cells, which contain genetic material. Organelles are found in the cytoplasm of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells can be plant cells or animal cells. Prokaryotic cells. The main characteristic of prokaryotic cells is that DNA, the genetic material, is floating in the cytoplasm instead of being stored in the nucleus. Bacteria are prokaryotic cells. The cytoplasm is a thick solution found inside the membrane. Organelles are located in the cytoplasm. The membrane is a layer that surrounds the cell. Membranes structure and protect the cell from the outside environment. They also allow food in and release waste substances. The nucleoid is the part of cell where DNA is found. DNA is formed by genes which store the genetic information of a living being. The flagellum is found in some prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. It's a lash-like appendage which allows a cell to move. Sperm cells, for example, move via flagella. Animal cells. Animal cells make up tissues, and these make up animal and human body organs. Each cell has a specific function depending on which organ system it belongs to. An animal cell is a eukaryotic cell. DNA is stored in the nucleus. The nucleus is in charge of all cell functions. DNA is stored in the nucleus. DNA is made up by genes which hold genetic information. When animals reproduce, the genetic material will pass on to their young. For this reason, baby animals will have their same characteristics. The membrane is a layer that surrounds and protects the cell from the outside environment. The main function of the membrane is to allow food in and release waste substances. The cytoplasm is a thick solution found inside the membrane. Organelles are located in the cytoplasm. A mitochondrion is the organelle in charge of producing the energy in the cell. Plant cells. Trees, flowers, vegetables, or fruit are made up of plant cells. These are in charge of the growth cycle. More specifically, vegetables make their own food through photosynthesis. A plant cell is a eukaryotic cell. The nucleus is in charge of all cell functions. DNA is stored in the nucleus. DNA is made up by genes which hold genetic information. When plants reproduce, the genetic material will pass on to the new plant. For this reason, new plants will have the same characteristics. The membrane is a layer that surrounds and protects the cell from the outside environment. The main function of the membrane is to allow food in and release waste substances. Membranes have rigid wall cells which hold up the plant. The cytoplasm is a thick solution found inside the membrane. Organelles are located in the cytoplasm. Chloroplasts are the organelles which produce and store chemical components essential to the cell. For example, chlorophyll, which gives plants their green color, is stored in the chloroplasts. Chlorophyll also plays an important role in photosynthesis. A mitochondrion is the organelle in charge of producing the energy in the cell.
We've learned so much in just one video. Did you know there are many more videos? Imagine how much you could learn. Subscribe to the Smile and Learn educational channel to learn and have fun at the same time.